Deep inside the Great Pyramid of Giza is a passage so narrow that no human can crawl through it. For thousands of years, no one knew where it led or why the ancient Egyptians had built it. Then researchers sent a small robotic camera into the darkness. It crawled farther and farther through the shaft until, suddenly, its path was blocked. Directly ahead was a limestone slab with two strange copper fittings, the closest thing this tiny passage had to a sealed door. Researchers eventually managed to look beyond it, into a space that human eyes had not seen for roughly 4,500 years. But what they found on the other side didn't solve the mystery. It made the Great Pyramid even harder to explain. But to understand why that tiny sealed passage is so extraordinary, you first have to understand the gigantic structure surrounding it. When completed around 4,500 years ago, the Great Pyramid stood roughly 481 feet, or 146.6 meters high. Its base covers about 13 acres, enough space for roughly 10 American football fields. And the entire monument is commonly estimated to contain around 2.3 million stone blocks. Many weigh several tons, while some of the enormous granite blocks used inside weigh tens of tons. Now forget the mysterious door for a moment. How did people build something this enormous thousands of years before trucks, powered cranes, or modern construction machinery existed? Because almost every stage of its construction creates another problem that seems impossible. How did ancient builders align this enormous monument so accurately with north, south, east, and west without modern surveying equipment? How did they level its gigantic foundation, quarry millions of stone blocks, and transport enormous pieces of limestone and granite without trucks? And once those stones reached Giza, how were blocks weighing many tons raised higher and higher without powered cranes? Why something this enormous was built in the first place? And what was waiting beyond that mysterious stone barrier when the robot finally looked behind it? The first problem appeared before a single block could even be stacked. The builders had to decide exactly which way the pyramid would face. That sounds simple today, but they had no GPS, no modern surveying instruments, and no magnetic compass to point them north. Yet the four sides of the Great Pyramid were aligned remarkably closely with the four cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west. So how did surveyors more than 4,500 years ago find north with such accuracy? One leading explanation is that they looked upward. Ancient Egyptian surveyors could observe the movement of stars around the northern sky and use astronomical observations to establish a precise direction. Circumpolar stars, stars that appear to circle the celestial pole without setting, have been proposed as part of the method. Exactly how the builders achieved the alignment is still debated, but the accuracy they left behind is measurable in the pyramid itself. They had found their direction, but that solved only the first problem, because knowing where to build was useless if the ground beneath millions of tons of stone wasn't level. Now came a problem where even a small mistake could become enormous. The pyramid would eventually rise nearly 481 feet into the air. If its foundation began unevenly, that error could become increasingly difficult to control as millions of tons of stone were stacked above it. But once again, the builders had no laser levels or modern surveying equipment. So how did they create such an extraordinarily level base across such a huge area? The exact method is still debated. One proposed technique involves using water as a natural reference level, possibly in channels or trenches cut into the site. Other explanations suggest that ancient surveyors used simple leveling instruments, sighting methods, repeated measurements, and carefully marked reference points. What we can see today is the result. The builders cut and prepared the natural bedrock with remarkable consistency across the pyramid's enormous base. But a perfectly prepared construction site was still just an empty foundation. To turn it into the Great Pyramid, they now needed an almost unimaginable quantity of stone. And this is where the scale of the Great Pyramid becomes almost difficult to imagine. A large amount of its core limestone could be quarried directly from the Giza Plateau. But getting stone out of the ground was only the beginning. Workers had to separate blocks from the surrounding rock, shape them, move them, and prepare them for their place in the monument. They did this without steel blades or powered cutting machines. Instead, Egyptian stone workers had copper tools, wooden implements, hard stone pounders such as dolerite, and abrasive materials like sand that could help grind and work stone. It was not a single magical tool that made the pyramid possible. It was technique, repeated blows, abrasion, measurement, and an enormous amount of human labor. Imagine finishing one heavy block after hours of exhausting work, only to remember that the pyramid would require an extraordinary number of blocks. And there was an even bigger problem. Not all of the stone they wanted was waiting beside the pyramid. Some had to travel across Egypt. So how do you move stones weighing many tons when trucks don't exist? Some of the builder's stone was close. Much of the limestone used for the pyramid's core came directly from the Giza plateau. But the finest white limestone used for the outer casing came from Tura, on the opposite side of the Nile, and some of the granite used deep inside the pyramid came from Aswan, more than 500 miles, or around 800 kilometers, to the south. Moving stones that far without trucks sounds almost impossible, but the Egyptians had something far more useful than a road network: the Nile. Heavy stone could travel by boat through the river and connected waterways, while sledges and teams of workers helped move blocks across land. There is even evidence that wetting sand in front of a loaded sledge could reduce the resistance and make an enormous load easier to pull. And we have something even more remarkable than a theory. An ancient document known as the Diary of Mary records a work crew transporting limestone from Tura by boat toward the Great Pyramid project during the reign of Khufu, but delivering a massive stone to Giza only brought it to ground level. The pyramid above it would eventually rise almost 500 feet into the sky. And now the builders faced perhaps the most famous mystery of all. How do you get millions of heavy blocks up there without a powered crane? Getting the stones to Giza was difficult. Getting them off the ground was an entirely different problem. As each layer of the pyramid rose, the next blocks had to rise with it. There were no powered cranes waiting to lift several tons of stone into position. So the Egyptians had to turn the construction site itself into a machine. We know that ancient Egyptians used ramps, sledges, ropes, and organized hauling to move heavy loads. What we still don't know for certain is the exact ramp system used throughout the Great Pyramid's construction. A large straight ramp may have served some stages. Other proposed designs use ramps running along the sides, zigzagging upward, or wrapping around parts of the growing pyramid. And the answer may not have been one ramp at all. The builders could have changed their approach as the pyramid became taller. Whatever the exact arrangement, the basic challenge remained brutally physical. Teams had to coordinate their pull, ropes had to hold, sledges had to keep moving, and enormous blocks had to climb upward little by little. Do that once, and it is an impressive engineering achievement. Do it again and again as a stone mountain rises beneath you, and the true scale of the problem becomes clear. But even limestone wasn't the material that posed the hardest question. Because deep inside the Great Pyramid, the builders used a stone far more difficult to work: granite. Deep inside the Great Pyramid, the challenge changed again. The king's chamber and several massive structural elements around it were made from granite, a stone far harder to work than the limestone used through most of the pyramid. And these blocks had traveled all the way from Aswan, hundreds of miles to the south. But transporting granite was only half the mystery. How do you shape and cut such hard stone when your metal tools are mostly copper? Evidence suggests the Egyptians relied on several techniques. Hard dolerite pounders could repeatedly batter and shape the granite, while copper saws and drills could be used together with abrasive materials such as quartz-rich sand. The important part is the abrasive. Instead of a modern toothed blade simply slicing through the granite, hard abrasive grains between the tool and the stone could gradually wear the surface away. It was slow. It demanded enormous patience, but repeated thousands upon thousands of times, tiny amounts of stone disappeared. And that may be the most impressive part of the entire story. The Egyptians did not need secret futuristic machines. They needed something much more believable, and in many ways more extraordinary. A deep understanding of materials, abrasion, leverage, organization, and what thousands of coordinated human beings could accomplish. But tools, boats, ramps, and ropes explain only part of the Great Pyramid, because behind every stone was the most complicated machine on the entire construction site: people. The familiar image of endless enslaved workers being whipped while dragging stones is not what the archaeological evidence from Giza points to. Instead, researchers have uncovered evidence of organized work crews, skilled craftspeople, administrators, and settlements connected with the enormous labor force supporting the project. These workers had to be housed and fed. Tools needed replacing. Stone had to arrive at the right time. Crews had to know where to work, what to move, and where each load was going next. Even the workers themselves were organized into named groups and smaller teams, turning thousands of people into a coordinated labor system. And, that changes the way we should look at the Great Pyramid. It isn't simply a pile of roughly 2.3 million blocks. It is the result of millions of coordinated actions: feeding, measuring, hauling, planning, shaping, and building, repeated year after year. Which raises another question: why would an ancient society organize so many people and resources to build something this enormous? So why devote this extraordinary amount of labor, material, and organization to a single monument? The Great Pyramid was built for Pharaoh Khufu and formed the centerpiece of a much larger funerary complex. For the ancient Egyptians, this was more than an enormous tomb. It was connected to royal power, death, and beliefs about the king's journey into the afterlife. That helps explain why such extraordinary resources could be concentrated on its construction. But when the builders finally left Giza, they also left behind questions that would survive far longer than they could have imagined. Because thousands of years later, modern researchers were still finding features hidden inside the monument, including that tiny shaft we entered at the beginning and the mysterious stone barrier waiting at its end. Now we can finally return to the question we left unanswered at the beginning. What was actually waiting behind that mysterious stone barrier? The robot had traveled through one of the narrow shafts connected to the Queen's chamber until it reached a limestone blocking stone fitted with 2 copper elements. Researchers eventually drilled a tiny hole through the stone and passed a camera beyond it. But there was no treasure chamber waiting on the other side. No hidden pharaoh. No room filled with gold. Instead, the camera revealed a small space beyond the first blocking stone. And then came the part that made the discovery even stranger. At the far end was another blocking stone. The first barrier hadn't ended the mystery. It had simply hidden another barrier behind itself. And more than 4,500 years after these shafts were constructed, their exact purpose is still debated, which leaves us with a question even the robot could not answer. Why did the builders create these tiny shafts in the first place? And perhaps that is what makes the Great Pyramid truly extraordinary. Its builders did not need impossible technology. They used observation, mathematics, stoneworking, boats, sledges, ropes, simple machines, enormous organization, and generations of accumulated knowledge. 4,500 years later, we can explain much of how this stone mountain was built. And yet, some of its smallest hidden spaces are still forcing us to ask questions about one of the largest structures humanity has ever created.